HOA sold black man's ranch while he was deployed. The army took back every house. Auctioned. Sold. The gavel slammed down in the county courthouse, echoing like a gunshot through the packed room. A smug HOA president in his pressed khakis and polo shirt shook hands with a wealthy developer, their grins spreading like oil slicks across their faces as papers exchanged hands. What they had just sold wasn't theirs to sell. It was Sergeant David Carter's ranch, land that had been in his family for 3 generations, soil that had known the sweat of his grandfather's brow, his father's determination, and now his own dreams. At that very moment, David Carter was 8,000 miles away in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, leading troops through hostile territory, dodging IEDs and insurgent fire, serving the very country whose laws were supposed to protect his property. But when the United States Army found out what had been done to their brother-in-arms, when they discovered the betrayal that had occurred while he bled for freedom, they brought justice down on that entire neighborhood with the force of a military operation, house by house, deed by deed, until every stolen property was returned and every conspirator faced the consequences of their greed. This is not just a story about property theft. This is a story about what happens when civilian corruption meets military brotherhood. This is about what happens when you mess with one of America's warriors while they're defending your right to sleep peacefully at night. This is about the day an entire HOA learned that the United States military doesn't just protect democracy abroad, they protect their own at home. Welcome to Touching Black Stories channel. Every story we share is more than just drama. It's a reminder of strength, resilience, and justice. If you believe in celebrating Black excellence and standing against injustice and prejudice, hit that like and subscribe button right now. We would like to know where you are watching from and what time is it for you right now in the comment. Sergeant First Class David Marcus Carter stood on the hill overlooking his 47 acres of Texas land as the sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. It was 5:30 in the morning, 3 days before his deployment, and he wanted to burn this image into his memory. Something beautiful to hold onto when the desert, sand, and danger would surround him for the next 18 months. This wasn't just land to David Carter. This was a legacy. This was history. This was proof that a Black family in America could build something lasting, something that couldn't be taken away, or so he thought. The ranch had been purchased by his grandfather, Elijah Carter, in 1962, when Black families owning substantial property in Texas was not just rare but dangerous. Elijah had saved every penny from 20 years of working in the oil fields, enduring discrimination, threats, and violence to accumulate enough money to buy this land outright. No loans, no mortgages, no liens, he paid cash, knowing that any financial entanglement could be used as a weapon against a Black landowner in the Jim Crow South. David's father, Marcus Carter, had expanded the ranch in the 1980s, adding another 20 acres, building the stables, and digging the wells that would make the land self-sufficient. Marcus had served in Vietnam, and when he came home, he poured his energy into making the ranch a fortress of self-reliance. He raised cattle, grew vegetables, and most importantly, he raised David with the understanding that this land was more than property. It was proof that the Carter family had carved out their piece of the American dream with their own hands. And now it was David's turn to be the guardian of this legacy. At 38 years old, he had already served 4 tours of duty, 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. He had earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and enough commendations to wallpaper a room. But more than medals, David had earned respect. In his unit, he wasn't just Sergeant Carter. He was the man you wanted beside you when bullets started flying, the leader who would carry you out if you fell, the soldier who exemplified what it meant to serve with honor. The ranch reflected David's military precision and discipline. The fences were maintained with geometric perfection. The barn was organized like an army supply depot. The main house, a sprawling 2-story structure his father had built, was immaculate. David had modernized it over the years, installing solar panels, updating the plumbing and electrical systems, making it both a testament to the past and a beacon for the future. But David's pride and joy was the memorial garden he had created for fallen soldiers. In the southeast corner of the property, he had planted an oak tree for every member of his unit who hadn't made it home. 23 trees now stood in perfect formation, their branches reaching toward the sky like the souls of the warriors they represented. Under each tree was a small plaque with a name, rank, and date. David would sit among those trees in the evening, sharing a beer with ghosts, telling them about his day, keeping their memory alive. The morning of his deployment briefing, 2 weeks before he would leave, David had a meeting that would later prove to be the first sign of trouble. Richard Lawson, the president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, had requested to speak with him. The HOA had been established 5 years earlier when the area around David's ranch had been developed into suburban neighborhoods. David's ranch, which had been there for decades before any suburban development, had been grandfathered in, exempt from most HOA regulations, though technically within their expanded jurisdiction. Richard Lawson was everything David wasn't: soft where David was hard, entitled where David was earned, bitter where David was accomplished. At 53, Richard was a real estate developer who had made his money flipping houses and saw the HOA presidency as both a power trip and a business opportunity. He arrived at David's ranch in his pristine white BMW, looking at the property with the calculating eyes of a man who saw dollar signs instead of heritage. "David," Richard began, his tone already condescending, "we need to talk about your property." "Sergeant Carter," David corrected calmly. "And my property is not up for discussion." Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. "The thing is, Sergeant Carter, your ranch is affecting property values in the area. The sight of cattle, the smell, the fact that it's agricultural land in what's now a residential zone, it's becoming a problem." David looked at this man standing on his land, this newcomer trying to tell him his family's legacy was a problem, and he maintained his military bearing, though inside, his anger was building like a storm. "Mr. Lawson, this ranch has been here since before you were born. It was here before your HOA, before your suburban development, before your property values became your god. It's zoned agricultural, it's grandfathered in, and it's not going anywhere." Richard smiled, but it was the smile of a snake. "Things change, Sergeant. Neighborhoods evolve. Sometimes what was acceptable in the past isn't acceptable anymore." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality. I'm trying to be neighborly here. I'm willing to make you an offer on behalf of some interested developers. $3 million. Cash. You could buy a nice little place somewhere else, somewhere more appropriate." David stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over Richard. "Mr. Lawson, let me be crystal clear. This land is not for sale. Not for $3 million, not for $30 million. This is Carter land, and it will be Carter land long after you and your HOA are dust. Now get off my property." Richard's face flushed red, but he maintained his composure. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant. This offer won't be on the table forever." "Good. Because I'd hate to have to keep refusing it. Don't come back here, Lawson. Ever." As Richard drove away, David didn't know he had just made an enemy who would stop at nothing to take what wasn't his. David had faced insurgents, terrorists, and enemy soldiers, but he had never faced the kind of enemy who smiled while planning your destruction, who used legal loopholes as weapons, who wrapped their greed in the flag of community improvement. 3 days before deployment, David met with his lawyer, James Patterson, an old Army buddy who had traded his uniform for a law degree. They went over everything: the will, the power of attorney, the property documents. "Everything's in order, David," James assured him. "The ranch is protected. Your wife has power of attorney if anything needs to be handled while you're gone. The property taxes are paid 2 years in advance. There's no way anyone can touch this place." David's wife, Angela, was moving with their 2 children to her mother's house in Houston for the duration of his deployment. It was safer there, easier for the kids' schooling, and Angela could help care for her aging mother. The ranch would stand empty but secure, checked on weekly by the Martinez family who ran the neighboring farm. "I just have a bad feeling," David said, unusual for a man who typically dealt in facts, not feelings. "That HOA president, Lawson, he wants this land bad." "He can want it all he wants," James replied. "Wanting and getting are 2 different things. The law is clear. As long as you pay your taxes and maintain the property, no HOA can force a sale of grandfathered agricultural land." But what neither David nor James knew was that Richard Lawson had already begun researching obscure property laws, looking for any crack, any loophole, any way to steal what he couldn't buy. He had found something, an old statute about abandoned property, rarely used, probably unconstitutional, but potentially effective if no one was around to challenge it. The morning David left for deployment, he stood once more on that hill overlooking his land. Angela stood beside him, their children, Marcus Jr. and Eliana, playing in the grass at their feet. "It'll be here when you get back," Angela said, sensing his unease. "This land has survived worse than Richard Lawson." David pulled his family close. "I know. It's just, this is the longest deployment yet. 18 months is a long time." "The land will wait," Angela said. "It knows you're coming home." As the Carter family drove away that morning, heading to the base where David would begin his journey to Afghanistan, Richard Lawson was sitting in his home office, studying property law, making phone calls to other HOA board members, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most egregious acts of theft in Texas legal history. David Carter was about to spend 18 months defending democracy abroad, not knowing that the real threat to his freedom was not in the mountains of Afghanistan but in the comfortable suburbs of Texas, wearing a polo shirt and khakis, armed not with rifles but with legal documents and a corrupt interpretation of the law. If you're already feeling your blood pressure rise, if you're already sensing the injustice that's about to unfold, hit that subscribe button right now because this story is about to show you just how far some people will go to steal what isn't theirs, and how spectacular their downfall can be. If you were deployed overseas, who would you trust to protect your home? 6 weeks after David Carter's boots hit the ground in Afghanistan, Richard Lawson called a special meeting of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association Board. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the community center, a building that overlooked the Carter Ranch like a vulture eyeing carrion. Present at the meeting were the 5 board members: Richard Lawson as president, Janet Mills as vice president, Thomas Crawford as treasurer, Patricia Young as secretary, and Harold Bennett as member-at-large. What they all had in common, besides their positions on the board, was that they were all white, all relatively wealthy, and all had moved to the area within the last decade, long after the Carter Ranch had been established. Richard had prepared his presentation carefully. He had charts showing property values, carefully manipulated to suggest that the Carter Ranch was depressing home prices. He had photos taken at angles that made the ranch look dilapidated when in reality it was meticulously maintained. He had complaints, manufactured or exaggerated, about smells, sounds, and sights that allegedly disturbed the neighboring homeowners. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the false concern of a practiced manipulator, "we have a situation that requires our immediate attention. The Carter property, 47 acres of what should be prime development land, is holding our entire community back." Janet Mills, a woman who wore her prejudices as proudly as her pearl necklace, nodded eagerly. "I've been saying this for years. That eyesore doesn't belong in a modern neighborhood." "It's not just an aesthetic issue," Richard continued, warming to his theme. "It's a safety issue. Unattended livestock could escape and cause accidents. The property could become a haven for criminals with the owner absent. We have a responsibility to the community." Thomas Crawford, the treasurer, was more cautious. "But Richard, the property is grandfathered in. We don't have jurisdiction." "Actually," Richard interrupted, pulling out a thick folder of documents, "I've been doing some research. There's a provision in Texas property law, rarely used but still on the books, about abandoned agricultural property within incorporated areas." He distributed copies of an obscure statute from 1947, originally designed to deal with genuinely abandoned farms during the post-World War II suburban expansion. The law stated that if agricultural property within an incorporated area was left unattended and unmaintained for more than 90 days, the local governing body could initiate proceedings to force a sale for the public good. "But the property isn't abandoned," Patricia Young pointed out, showing more integrity than the others. "Sergeant Carter is deployed. His wife has power of attorney." "His wife who hasn't been seen at the property in 6 weeks, Richard countered. "His wife, who's living in Houston, does not maintain the ranch. The Martinez family checking on it once a week doesn't constitute active maintenance under the law." What Richard didn't mention was that he had been documenting every day the property appeared unoccupied, taking photos that deliberately avoided showing the Martinez family's visits, building a false paper trail of abandonment. Harold Bennett, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "This feels wrong, Richard. The man is serving our country. And we're serving our community," Richard shot back. "Look, I'm not saying we steal his property. I'm saying we use legal channels to force a sale at fair market value. He'll get paid. He can buy something more appropriate when he returns." "Define fair market value," Thomas asked. Richard smiled. "Agricultural land value, not development value. About $300,000 for the whole 47 acres. The room fell silent. Everyone knew that as development land, the property was worth 10 times that amount. This wasn't just forcing a sale, it was theft with a legal veneer. "I need to think about this," Patricia said, gathering her papers. "Think quickly," Richard warned. "Every day we delay is another day our property values suffer, another day that prime land sits wasted." After the meeting, Richard didn't wait for full board approval. He began his campaign in earnest, knowing that if he could create enough momentum, the reluctant board members would fall in line rather than appear to be obstacles to community improvement. He started with a whisper campaign among the homeowners. At the golf club, at the country club, at the neighborhood barbecues, he planted seeds of discontent. "Have you noticed the smell from the Carter place lately?" he would ask, even though there was no smell. "I heard there were break-ins in the area, probably people knowing that the ranch is sitting empty," he would suggest, even though crime rates were at an all-time low. Within weeks, Richard had manufactured a crisis where none existed. He organized a petition, going door to door with a clipboard, presenting his case with the silver tongue of a seasoned con artist. "We're not trying to hurt anyone," he would say at each door. "We're just trying to protect our community. With Sergeant Carter deployed indefinitely, that property is essentially abandoned. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if it was properly developed? More homes mean more families, better schools, improved infrastructure." Some homeowners signed enthusiastically, their prejudices barely concealed. Others signed reluctantly, not wanting to appear unneighborly. A few refused outright, but they were in the minority. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, an elderly widow who had lived in the area for 30 years, was one of the few who stood up to Richard. "That ranch was here before your HOA, before your fancy houses, before you ever set foot in Texas, Mr. Lawson. David Carter is a hero, and you're trying to steal from him while he's fighting for our freedom." Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the ugliness beneath. "Mrs. Hastings, you might want to consider whose side you're on. HOAs have ways of dealing with problematic homeowners." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Mrs. Hastings slammed the door in his face, but she was now afraid. She had seen what HOAs could do: the fines for minor infractions, the legal harassment, the ability to make someone's life miserable through 1,000 small cuts. Meanwhile, Richard was building his legal case. He hired a surveyor to document every aspect of the property that could be construed as abandoned or undermaintained. The surveyor, Mike Thompson, was uncomfortable with the assignment from the start. "Mr. Lawson, this property is clearly being maintained," Mike said after his initial survey. "The grass is cut, the fences are intact, the buildings are secure." "Look harder," Richard instructed, slipping an extra $1,000 into Mike's hand. "I'm sure you can find some issues. Maybe the grass is a bit too long in places? Maybe there's somewhere on the fences that could be construed as deterioration." Mike took the money, his integrity crumbling like old mortar. His revised report painted a picture of a property sliding into neglect, grass allegedly overgrown, fences supposedly failing, buildings apparently showing signs of abandonment. It was a work of fiction dressed as professional assessment. Richard then approached the county clerk's office. The clerk, Diane Foster, was a by-the-book civil servant who had held her position for 20 years. When Richard presented his case for initiating abandonment proceedings against the Carter Ranch, she was immediately suspicious. "Mr. Lawson, this statute you're citing hasn't been used in decades. And it certainly was never intended to be used against deployed military personnel. The law doesn't make exceptions based on why someone abandons their property, Richard argued, knowing full well that David hadn't abandoned anything. Sergeant Carter hasn't abandoned his property. He's serving his country. That's a matter for the courts to decide. I'm simply filing the appropriate paperwork as is my right as HOA president concerned about community welfare. Diane wanted to refuse, but Richard had done his homework. Technically, he had the right to file the petition. Whether it would succeed was another matter, but she couldn't prevent him from filing. "This is wrong," she said as she stamped the documents. "This is morally wrong." "Morality is subjective," Richard replied. "The law is not." With the paperwork filed, the clock started ticking. Under the statute, once abandonment proceedings were initiated, the property owner had 90 days to respond or the property could be subject to forced sale. The notices would be sent to the property address, where no one was living, and to the last known address of the owner, which Richard had listed as the ranch itself, not Angela's mother's house in Houston where she was actually staying. It was a calculated move. Richard knew that with David deployed and Angela in Houston, the chances of them receiving and responding to the notice in time were minimal. He was counting on bureaucratic inertia and the fog of war to provide cover for his theft. But Richard had underestimated the Martinez family, the neighboring farmers who had been checking on the Carter ranch. Rosa Martinez had noticed Richard and his surveyors snooping around the property. She had seen them taking photos, measuring things, acting suspicious. Her instincts, honed by years of dealing with people trying to take advantage of immigrant farmers, told her something was wrong. Rosa called Angela in Houston. "Mrs. Carter, there's been strange activity around your ranch. Men in suits taking pictures, measuring things. It doesn't feel right." Angela's blood ran cold. She knew immediately that Richard Lawson was up to something. She tried calling James Patterson, David's lawyer, but he was on vacation in Europe, unreachable for 2 weeks. She tried calling the HOA directly, but was told that any concerns about property matters had to be submitted in writing and would be addressed at the next board meeting, in 30 days. The system was working exactly as Richard had designed it to work. Slowly, bureaucratically, favoring those who knew how to manipulate it over those who simply wanted to live their lives in peace. This is how freedom is stolen, not with guns and violence, but with paperwork and procedures. If you're feeling the rage building, if you want to see justice served, hit that subscribe button because the story is far from over. Do you think HOAs have too much power over homeowners? The courthouse in Macon County, Texas, was built in 1923, a testament to a different era when justice was supposed to be blind, impartial, and fair. On the morning of November 15th, that courthouse would witness one of the most egregious perversions of justice in its 100-year history. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Richard Lawson arrived at 8 a.m., making sure everything was in place. He had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military operation, ironic considering he was stealing from an actual military operator. The legal notices had been published in the smallest circulation newspaper in the county, technically fulfilling the publication requirement while ensuring minimal exposure. The posting at the courthouse had been placed on a bulletin board in the basement, behind a door marked "Maintenance," where no one would accidentally stumble upon it. Richard had brought his own audience, carefully selected HOA members and local developers who were in on the scheme. They filled the first 2 rows of the small auction room, creating the appearance of legitimate public interest. Among them was Gerald Foster, a developer who had already agreed to purchase the property for $800,000, still far below its market value but enough to make it look less like outright theft. What Richard didn't expect was Eleanor Hastings, the elderly widow who had stood up to him months earlier. She had been watching, investigating, and gathering evidence of Richard's scheme. She sat in the back row, her phone ready to record everything. Next to her sat Rosa and Miguel Martinez, the farmers who had been protecting the Carter Ranch as best they could. Judge Harold McKinney, presiding over the auction, was not corrupt. He was simply indifferent. At 71, 6 months from retirement, he had no interest in questioning the paperwork before him. As far as he was concerned, if the legal requirements had been met, the auction would proceed. We are here today for the forced sale of the property at 1847 Old Ranch Road, consisting of 47 acres, Due to abandonment under Texas Statute 47.293, the judge intoned, reading from his prepared statement. Eleanor Hastings stood up. Your Honor, this is wrong. The owner is deployed in Afghanistan serving our country. The judge looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Ma'am, unless you have legal standing in this matter, please sit down. I have moral standing, Eleanor shot back. This is theft. Ma'am, sit down or I'll have you removed. Eleanor sat, but her phone was now recording, live streaming to her granddaughter who was a journalist in Dallas. Richard stood to present his case, his voice dripping with false concern. Your Honor, we take no pleasure in this action. However, the property in question has been abandoned for over 6 months. It poses a health and safety risk to the surrounding community. We have followed all legal procedures, provided all required notices. We're simply asking the court to enforce the law. Has the owner been notified? The judge asked, going through the motions. All legally required notifications have been sent and published, Your Honor. The 90-day response period has expired with no response from the owner. What Richard didn't say was that David Carter had indeed tried to respond, from Afghanistan, through military channels, the moment he learned about the proceedings from Angela. But his response, sent via military email and fax, had been mysteriously lost in the HOA's filing system, never making it to the court. Rosa Martinez stood up. Your Honor, I have proof that this property is not abandoned. My family has been maintaining it. We have photos, dates. Ma'am, are you the legal representative of the owner? No, but... Then you have no standing. Sit down. The judge was following the letter of the law, but the law itself was being twisted into a weapon against those it was meant to protect. Are there any legal representatives of the owner present? The judge asked, knowing the answer. Silence filled the courtroom. David's lawyer was still in Europe. Angela was frantically driving from Houston but was still 2 hours away. The system had been gamed perfectly. Then we will proceed with the auction. The minimum bid is set at $300,000 for the entire 47-acre property. Eleanor gasped audibly. The property was worth at least $3 million, possibly more. This wasn't just theft, it was grand larceny wrapped in legal procedures. Gerald Foster raised his hand. $300,000. $300,000 going once. Rosa Martinez desperately raised her hand. $301,000. She didn't have that kind of money, but she had to try something. Richard turned to her with a cold smile. Do you have proof of funds, Mrs. Martinez? Rosa's shoulders slumped. She didn't, of course. She was a small farmer trying to save her neighbor's land with money she didn't have. The bid remains at $300,000, the judge stated. $400,000, another voice called out. It was Thomas Crawford, the HOA treasurer, who had apparently developed a conscience too late. Richard glared at him. What are you doing? The right thing for once, Thomas replied. $500,000, Gerald Foster increased his bid as planned. $600,000, Thomas countered. Richard whispered urgently to Gerald, and Gerald nodded. $800,000. Thomas looked defeated. He didn't have that kind of liquid capital. He had tried, but his attempt at redemption had failed. $800,000 going at once. Eleanor was now on the phone with her granddaughter. Sarah, you need to get this story out now. They're stealing a soldier's ranch while he's deployed. The whole thing is corrupt. $800,000 going twice. Rosa Martinez was crying. Miguel held her, both of them feeling the weight of their inability to help their neighbor, the man who had always been there for them when they needed help. Sold. The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin nail. Richard Lawson couldn't contain his smile. He shook Gerald Foster's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who had just pulled off the heist of the century. Congratulations, Mr. Foster. You've just acquired the finest piece of undeveloped land in the county. And you've just made yourself a very rich man with your finder's fee, Gerald replied quietly. The finder's fee, that was the real corruption. Richard would receive $200,000 from Gerald for facilitating the sale. It was money laundering through legal channels, bribery dressed as business. As the paperwork was being signed, Eleanor Hastings stood up one more time. You should all be ashamed. Every last one of you. That land has been in the Carter family for 3 generations. David Carter has a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart. He's bled for this country, and this is how you repay him." Richard turned to her with undisguised contempt. "Mrs. Hastings, Sergeant Carter should have thought about his property before he decided to play soldier. This is business, not charity." "Play soldier?" Miguel Martinez erupted. "He's not playing anything. He's fighting terrorists while you're stealing his land." "Bailiff, remove these people," the judge ordered, having heard enough. As Eleanor, Rosa, and Miguel were escorted out, Eleanor turned to the room one last time. "This isn't over. The whole world is going to know what happened here today." Outside the courthouse, the 3 of them stood in the cold November air, feeling the weight of their failure. But Eleanor's granddaughter, Sarah, was already working. The video Eleanor had secretly recorded was being edited, prepared for release. The story was being written. Contacts were being made. Inside, Richard was concluding the transaction. The deed was transferred, the money was wired, and just like that, 47 acres of Carter family land became the property of Foster Development, LLC. "When do you plan to start development?" the judge asked Gerald, making small talk. "Immediately," Gerald replied. "We'll have the old structures demolished within a week. Groundbreaking for the new subdivision in a month." "The memorial garden," Rosa whispered to Miguel, remembering David's tribute to his fallen comrades. "They're going to destroy the memorial garden." Word of the sale spread through the community like wildfire. Some celebrated, seeing it as progress, as the removal of an eyesore that had been holding back their property values. Others were horrified, recognizing the injustice but feeling powerless to stop it. That evening, Richard held a celebration at his home. Champagne flowed, and the talk was all about the future development, the new homes that would be built, the money that would be made. "You did it, Richard," Janet Mills gushed. "You actually did it." "It was all perfectly legal," Richard replied, loud enough for everyone to hear, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "We followed every procedure, every requirement. If Sergeant Carter wanted to keep his land, he should have responded to the notices." Harold Bennett, who had initially opposed the scheme, sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey, his conscience eating at him. "Richard, what happens when he comes home? When will he finds out?" Richard laughed. "He'll get a check for $800,000. More than twice what he would have gotten if he'd taken my original offer. He should thank me." But even as Richard celebrated, the machinery of justice was beginning to turn. Sarah Hastings' story was picked up by the Associated Press within hours. "Texas soldiers' ranch sold while deployed in Afghanistan," read the headline. Social media exploded. Veterans organizations began mobilizing. And somewhere in the Pentagon, a phone was ringing in the office of General Patricia Hayes, David Carter's commanding officer's superior. The celebration at Richard's house continued late into the night, but unknown to him, his victory was already beginning to crumble. Every champagne toast was being matched by another share of the story online. Another veteran calling their congressman, another lawyer volunteering to take the case pro bono. Gerald Foster stood on the Carter Ranch that evening, looking at the memorial garden with its 23 oak trees. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. For the first time, he began to understand what he had participated in. These weren't just trees, they were monuments to sacrifice, to brotherhood, to everything that Richard Lawson could never understand. "We're really going to tear all this down?" his assistant asked. Gerald didn't answer. He was starting to realize that he had won the auction but might have lost something far more valuable: his soul. If this injustice is making your heart race, if you want to see these criminals get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because the army is about to show them what real power looks like. Would you have spoken up in that courtroom, or stayed silent like the crowd? 13 time zones away from Texas, in a fortified compound outside Kandahar, Sergeant First Class David Carter was leading a briefing for his squad when his commanding officer, Captain James Mitchell, walked in with an expression David had only seen once before, when they had lost 3 men to an IED. "Sergeant Carter, a word." David handed the briefing to his second-in-command and followed Captain Mitchell to his office. a cramped space that served as the nerve center for their operations. "David, sit down." "What's happened, sir?" "Is it Angela?" "The kids." "Your family is fine, David. But there's been a situation with your property back home." Captain Mitchell turned his laptop around, showing David the news story that was now trending nationwide. The headline hit him like a physical blow: "Deployed Soldiers' Historic Family Ranch Seized and Sold by HOA." David read the article 3 times, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. His ranch, his grandfather's legacy, his father's pride, his children's inheritance, sold for a fraction of its value while he was 8,000 miles away defending the very freedoms that were supposed to protect his property rights. "This can't be legal," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not," Captain Mitchell replied firmly. "And the entire United States military is about to make that very clear." What David didn't know was that his story had reached the highest levels of military command within hours of going viral. General Patricia Hayes, a 2-star general who had risen through the ranks fighting both foreign enemies and domestic discrimination, had taken personal interest in the case. She had served with David's father in the Gulf War, had known Marcus Carter as a man of unshakable integrity. When she learned what had happened to his son's property, her response was swift and decisive. "Get me the Secretary of Defense on the line," she ordered her aide. "And then get me the best JAG officers we have. We're going to war, but this time the battlefield is a courtroom in Texas." Within 6 hours, a legal team had been assembled that would make any corporate law firm weep with envy. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Williams, the lead JAG officer, had prosecuted war crimes at The Hague. Major Robert Chen had successfully defended service members in hundreds of cases. Captain Maria Rodriguez specialized in property law and civil rights. Together, they formed a legal strike force that would descend on Macon County like the wrath of God. But the military response wasn't just legal, it was strategic. Every veterans organization in the country was mobilized. The American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Disabled American Veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, all issued simultaneous statements condemning the theft and demanding justice. Back in Texas, Richard Lawson was having his morning coffee when his phone began ringing. And ringing. And ringing. Reporters, veterans, angry citizens, everyone wanted a statement. He had prepared for some backlash, but nothing like this tsunami of rage. "Mr. Lawson, how do you justify stealing from a deployed soldier?" one reporter asked. "It wasn't theft," Richard insisted. "It was a legal procedure. Everything was done by the book." "The book you wrote," the reporter shot back. Meanwhile, Gerald Foster was in his office when his assistant burst in, pale-faced. "Mr. Foster, there are protesters outside. Hundreds of them." Gerald looked out his window to see a sea of veterans, some in wheelchairs, some on crutches, all holding signs. "Foster stole from a hero. Give back the Carter Ranch. Shame on Foster Development." Leading the protest was Master Sergeant, retired, William Brooks, a Vietnam veteran who had lost both legs in the war. Speaking to the crowd through a bullhorn, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Gerald Foster thinks he can steal from one of our brothers while he's in harm's way. Richard Lawson thinks his HOA is more powerful than the United States military. They're about to learn differently." The crowd roared approval. Local news crews were broadcasting live. The story had gone from regional interest to national outrage in less than 24 hours. In Washington, D.C., Senator Rebecca Martinez, herself a former Army captain, stood on the Senate floor delivering a blistering speech. "Madam President, while Sergeant David Carter was dodging bullets in Afghanistan, Richard Lawson was stealing his family's heritage. While Sergeant Carter was protecting our freedoms, Gerald Foster was counting the money he'd make from this theft. This is not just a crime against one soldier, it's an assault on every man and woman who wears the uniform." The speech was viewed over 10 million times within hours. #JusticeForCarter became the top trending hashtag globally. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens united in their outrage. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated the power of military brotherhood. At Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell, and every other military installation across the country, Soldiers began organizing. They pooled their resources, setting up a legal fund for David. Within 48 hours, they had raised over $2 million. Master Sergeant Jerome Washington, stationed at Fort Hood, explained to a reporter, "When you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. Sergeant Carter would give his life for any of us. The least we can do is give our money to save his land." Back in Afghanistan, David was overwhelmed by the support. His unit had gathered around him, each soldier contributing what they could to the legal fund. His squad leader, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, handed him an envelope. "This is from the boys, Sarge. It's not much, but it's what we got." David opened it to find $3,000 in mixed bills, combat pay that his soldiers had sacrificed for him. "I can't take this," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You can and you will," Marcus replied. "You'd do the same for any of us." The legal team arrived in Texas like an invasion force. They set up a command center in a hotel in Macon County, transforming a conference room into a war room. Maps of the area covered the walls. Legal documents were stacked like ammunition. Laptops hummed like communication equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Williams addressed her team. "This isn't just about getting the land back. This is about sending a message that you cannot prey on deployed service members. We're going to hit them with everything: violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering. By the time we're done, Richard Lawson will wish he'd never heard the name Carter." The first salvo was fired when the legal team filed an emergency injunction to stop any development on the land. Judge Harold McKinney, the same judge who had presided over the auction, now found himself facing a very different courtroom. The sleepy indifference he had shown before was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed fear of a man who realized he might have been complicit in a federal crime. "Your Honor," Lieutenant Colonel Williams began, her voice carrying the same authority she had used prosecuting war criminals, "what occurred in this courtroom was not just illegal, it was an act of betrayal against a United States service member. The Service Members Civil Relief Act explicitly protects deployed military personnel from exactly this kind of predatory action." The proper procedures were followed. Richard Lawson's lawyer, a nervous man named Carl Peterson, attempted to argue. "Proper procedures?" Lieutenant Colonel Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean the notices sent to an empty house? The publication in a newspaper with a circulation of 12? The posting behind a maintenance door? Your Honor, this wasn't proper procedure. It was a conspiracy to commit fraud." The injunction was granted immediately. All development on the Carter Ranch was halted. But the legal team was just getting started. Major Chen had been investigating the financial relationships between Richard Lawson and Gerald Foster. What he found was a web of corruption that extended far beyond the Carter Ranch. "They've done this before," he announced to the team. 3 other properties in the last 5 years. All owned by minorities. All forced sales below market value. All developed by Foster with kickbacks to Lawson. This changed everything. What had started as a single case of theft was now a pattern of racketeering. The FBI was brought in. The Department of Justice opened an investigation. The Texas Attorney General announced his own probe. Richard Lawson was in his home when the FBI arrived with a search warrant. As agents carried out boxes of documents, computers, and financial records, Richard's neighbors, the same ones who had supported him, watched from their windows. The HOA president who had ruled like a small-town dictator was being brought down in the most public way possible. The military takes care of its own. If you believe in justice, if you stand with our service members, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of brotherhood. Should laws exist to protect deployed soldiers' homes from foreclosure or seizure? The federal courthouse in Dallas was packed beyond capacity on the morning of December 3rd. Media trucks lined the streets. Veterans filled every available seat, many standing in the aisles despite court officers' attempts to maintain order. The case of United States versus Lawson, Foster, et al. Had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning for every corrupt HOA, every predatory developer, every person who had ever tried to steal from those who served. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Williams stood before Judge Elizabeth Warren, a federal judge known for her no-nonsense approach and her particular disdain for those who violated the public trust. The prosecution team had worked 18-hour days preparing for this moment, and it showed in the mountain of evidence they had compiled. Your Honor, Lieutenant Colonel Williams began, what we will present today is not just evidence of a crime against Sergeant David Carter, but a systematic pattern of corruption, fraud, and racketeering that has stolen millions of dollars from honest homeowners, with a particular focus on minority families and military personnel. Richard Lawson sat at the defendant's table, his usual swagger replaced by the hollow look of a man watching his world collapse. Next to him, Gerald Foster had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The other HOA board members, Janet Mills, Patricia Young, and Harold Bennett, sat behind them, each having been charged as co-conspirators. The prosecution's first witness was Angela Carter, David's wife, who had driven through the night from Houston to testify. She took the stand with quiet dignity, her presence commanding respect. Mrs. Carter, Lieutenant Colonel Williams began, "Can you tell the court about your attempts to respond to the foreclosure notices?" Angela's voice was steady but filled with controlled anger. "We never received them at our actual address. My husband tried to respond from Afghanistan the moment we learned about it from neighbors. He sent emails, faxes, even had his commanding officer send official military correspondence. All of it was ignored or lost by the HOA. Do you have proof of these attempts?" Angela produced a folder. Email receipts, fax confirmations, certified mail receipts. "We did everything possible to respond, but Mr. Lawson made sure our responses never reached the court." The evidence was damning. The prosecution presented email trails showing Richard Lawson instructing his secretary to misfile any correspondence from the Carters. They showed bank records revealing the $200,000 payment from Foster to Lawson, disguised as a consulting fee. But the most devastating testimony came from Thomas Crawford, the HOA treasurer who had tried to bid against Foster at the auction. He had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, and his insider knowledge painted a picture of corruption that shocked even the veterans who thought they had seen everything. Richard called it cleaning up the neighborhood, Thomas testified. He specifically targeted properties owned by minorities and military families, knowing they were either too poor to fight back or too far away to respond in time. The Carter Ranch was going to be his masterpiece, 47 acres that he could turn into a fortune. "How many properties did this happen to?" Lieutenant Colonel Williams asked. "That I know of? 7. The Johnsons, an elderly black couple, lost their home while Mr. Johnson was in the hospital with cancer. The Nguyen family, Vietnamese immigrants, lost their property while they were visiting dying relatives overseas. The Ramirez family, the father was deployed to South Korea. Each time, Richard found a way to claim abandonment, force a sale, and Foster would buy at below-market rates." The courtroom erupted. Judge Warren had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Major Robert Chen took over the prosecution, presenting the financial evidence. Using charts and graphs that would make a forensic accountant weep with admiration, he showed how Lawson and Foster had created a criminal enterprise that had stolen over $15 million in property value from homeowners. This wasn't just theft, Major Chen explained. This was organized crime. They used the HOA as a criminal organization, the legal system as their weapon, and the absence of their victims as their opportunity. The defense attorney, Carl Peterson, tried to argue that everything had been done legally, that the statute had been followed, that his clients were simply business-minded individuals working within the law. Judge Warren's response was withering. Counselors, hiding behind badly interpreted statutes while stealing from deployed soldiers and vulnerable families, are not business-minded. It's criminal, and it's particularly reprehensible when done to those serving our country. As the trial progressed, more victims came forward. The Nguyen family testified through tears about losing the restaurant property they had worked 20 years to buy. Mrs. Johnson, now widowed, explained how losing their home had contributed to her husband's deteriorating health in his final months. But it was the testimony of the veterans that truly sealed the defendant's fate. One by one, soldiers who had served with David took the stand. They spoke not just of the land but of what it represented, the American dream that they fought to protect, The promise that their sacrifices meant something, that their country would protect their families while they protected their country. Master Sergeant William Brooks, the double amputee who had led the protests, wheeled himself to the stand. His testimony was brief but devastating. "I left my legs in Vietnam," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "I did it willingly, believing I was protecting American values: justice, fairness, the right to property." Richard Lawson and Gerald Foster represent everything we fought against: corruption, theft, the strong preying on the weak. They're not Americans. They're parasites. The defense case collapsed entirely when Harold Bennett, overcome with guilt, broke ranks and confessed everything. He revealed additional crimes, including bribery of local officials, tampering with mail, and destruction of evidence. "I'm ashamed," Harold said, looking directly at Angela Carter. "I knew it was wrong, but I was too cowardly to stop it. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." On December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, as several veterans noted with grim satisfaction, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, violation of the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, mail fraud, and a dozen other charges. Judge Warren's sentencing was swift and merciless. Richard Lawson, 15 years in federal prison, $5 million in fines, and restitution to all victims. Gerald Foster, 12 years in prison, forfeiture of all properties acquired through the scheme, $3 million in fines. The other conspirators received lesser sentences but all faced prison time. But the real justice came with the civil proceedings. Every property that had been stolen was returned to its rightful owners. The FBI's investigation revealed that the scheme had extended to 3 other counties, and dozens of properties were restored to families who had thought they would never see justice. The Carter Ranch was not just returned but restored. The military community had raised enough money not just for legal fees but for improvements. Veterans from across the country came to help rebuild, to plant new trees in the memorial garden, to ensure that the ranch was better than ever when David returned home. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit subscribe one final time and share this story. Because the only way to stop corruption is to make sure everyone knows what happens when they try to steal from America's heroes. Final question: what would you say to soldiers like David who fight for freedom abroad but are betrayed at home?